Hopes are high that a resolution on trade can be reached when the leaders of China and the U.S. meet later this week. But what obstacles stand in the way of a successful outcome? And what are the economic implications of a trade dispute for Asia? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan sitting in for Liu Xin. Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump are set to have an extended meeting at the G20 summit in Japan. The meeting aims to lay the groundwork for a resolution to the ongoing trade dispute between the U.S. and China. But how realistic is it that the two sides will be able to seek a resolution? And what obstacles might prevent a consensus being reached? Joining me in discussion here are Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies, Ms. Caihua from Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, an institution affiliated to China's Ministry of Commerce, and also Mr. Timothy Stratford, Chairman at the American Chamber of Commerce here in China, who is also a managing partner at Covington and Burling Beijing office. Welcome to you all. So now, China has repeatedly emphasized its trade agreements with the U.S. must be balanced, equal, and mutually beneficial. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi also stressed at the UN General Assembly that China will not yield to be blackmailed or yield to pressure. So talk to me, first of all, let me start with you. What do you see as the requirement of a balanced and equal and mutually beneficial trade deal?
Well, literally, equality means the state of being equal. In terms of the trade agreement between the U.S. and China, it means the state of being equal, especially in terms of status and rights. Here, I think 2 points need to be stressed. First, being equal means to show respect for the differences between the two countries in social and economic systems, development stages, and the development paths, and the role and rights, and also core interests and other major concerns. Therefore, each side should not cross the other's red lines. For example, sovereignties must not be undermined, and also development rights should be respected, just as the Prime Minister of Singapore, Rong, said during the Shangri-La's this year's Shangri-La's dialogue held in Singapore. No one should expect others to adopt the same economic and cultural system and even political system and a cultural value, and it is neither realistic nor reasonable to force others to do so, and the diversities of the world should be respected. I think both China and the U.S. need to make full use of these strengths of diversity. Diversity
should be respected. That is the Chinese perspective here, but Mr. Stratford, how about the U.S. perspective? How big is the gap between the Chinese ultimate goal and the U.S. ultimate goal here?
Well, trade negotiators from both countries have said that they think that the negotiations were already about 90% there. Of course, they also told me that some of the hardest issues were left for the very end. So I think that there's been a lot of progress. I think the idea that the agreement needs to be equal, it's hard to explain or understand what equal exactly means, but I think both sides need to see that entering into the agreement is in their own best interest. And certainly there are ways you can approach the negotiations that are more likely to be successful and some that maybe make negotiation harder. But I think that the professional trade negotiators from both countries have made an extraordinary effort through 11 rounds. They've gotten 90% of the way there. And I think we can hope that at Osaka, the two presidents will fully authorize their trade negotiators to try to close the gap of the remaining 10%.
How important is it for China to get an equal and fair and balanced, mutually beneficial deal?
Well, I think the principles Professor Zhu has mentioned are very important, not only in negotiations, I mean any negotiations with the United States, but also I think as a kind of if I can say, the doctrine of China's foreign policy or negotiations with other countries. And I think it also applies to the United States. When you look at in terms of principle, they are also, on the trade, instead of now, I think instead of free trade, we heard a lot of the U.S. talking about fair trade. My understanding by fair trade, certainly there are many interpretations, but here I think it also applies that the two negotiators have to treat each other with, in sense of certainly, with equality, but also sincerity. So I think these principles are very important. But I agree with Tim that we are very much looking for how these principles will be applied, but more, and the most important thing, whether they were able to get to that 10% that has been left over.
You mentioned that some of the hardest issues are left in the end, but coming into the negotiation, the U.S. side has made it clear they want to make a deal that is more beneficial to the U.S. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, even said himself that any deal with China cannot be 50-50. I mean, how can U.S. expect to find a fair solution or a resolution when it is not prepared to offer equal stance or equal terms to China?
Well, my advice to international observers is to not pay all that much attention to President Trump's tweets as far as interpreting the overall policy of the United States. His tweets are meant to have a political impact in the United States at a very particular point in time. I think that later on he'll say that the agreement reached is very much in China's interest as well as in the United States. So I don't think we should spend too much time worrying about the President's tweets, because his tweets say a lot of different things at different times to different audiences.
That itself is an interesting question here. Should we interpret his tweet as his tendency of his policy or not? That's the debate point itself. But is it unclear about who is going to meet whom halfway here? Ms. Zhu, what do you think?
I think Donald Trump's idea about China and the U.S. trade negotiation is still, we still need time to push forward. And three things maybe lay foundations for this groundwork. First, both sides need to reassess the impact of the ongoing trade war on each side's economy and the society and even the world. Second, both sides need to narrow their differences in the current negotiations. Especially what China most concerned is that the removal of additional tariffs, and also the realisticness of China's purchase of U.S. products, and thirdly, the balanced text of the trade agreement. I think this has actually very clearly explained and shown in China's position on its trade consultation with the U.S.
So how should China prepare for the meeting with Trump? Should we, like Mr. Stratford just mentioned, disregard all the provocative tweets from Trump altogether?
I think so far, after the telephone conversation between the two presidents, the two head of the delegations, negotiating teams, and they are being instructed to communicate, and before the summit, before the meeting. So I would expect that there must be something, coming out after their meetings, and so that see if there are any way out, if there are any new ideas coming out to address the remaining 10%, and by certainly from Chinese perspective, by following the principles and that China has been doing. And in this regard, the Chinese has made it very clear that the two sides have to work together to accommodate each other's legitimate concern in a balanced and reasonable way. In other words, my understanding is that China is ready to work with the United States to find a solution to that. Then the question is how the United States will be prepared to that. And for this regard, and in this regard, I think President Trump's tweets, despite I think Tim's advice, is significant for Chinese observers at least, I think.
Right. How do you react to what's been said here?
Well, I think the negotiators want to reach a deal. I think they're trying in good faith to do that, and I think we hope that the politicians will give them enough space to get the job done.
Whether they will give the negotiators enough space, Trump initiated a phone call conversation last week with President Xi. What do you read from President Trump's reaching out this time? Do you think he's able to deviate from his maximum pressure policy?
Well, I think maximum pressure is also matched with opening the door and putting out a hand of friendship. I think we can see him go back and forth, with different leaders around the world and the way he reacts to them. I think we just need to keep our eye on the overall goal and do what we need to do to get there. I think, to be honest, I think that President Trump is not desperate to get a deal. I think that his own political calculation is that if he shows that he's very tough on China in some sense, that might be okay. But I don't think that's a sensible approach for U.S.-China relations overall, and I don't think that's what the business community wants. I don't think it's what people in both countries want. And I think that President Trump will see that, and he'll show enough flexibility to get the deal done. But it's very difficult to call at this point, because I think he's the most unpredictable president that we've had in my lifetime, and that's going back 65 years.
And what are some of the key factors that's going to be discussed at the Osaka meeting this time, Ms. Zhu?
I do believe there will be old questions left in the previous rounds of negotiations, such as I mentioned, the removal of all the additional tariffs, and also the realisticness of the realistic of China's purchase of U.S. products, and also how to make a deal that is mutually acceptable in terms of its texts. I think these are all the old questions and issues, very tough issues for both sides to renegotiate. I don't think China will get any retreat from these positions, because China has made very clear on its position on these three respects. Therefore, I think the key is on the United States side, whether it has been prepared to make some withdrawal or make some concessions from their offerings or from their demands. So I think the possibility of reaching an agreement really depends on the U.S. side, not on the Chinese side.
China is not prepared to retreat on certain terms. What do you think, Mr. Rong? The biggest sticking point now, and how likely the two are going to meet some kind of middle ground here?
I think as far as I'm concerned, if we follow the news release of the telephone conversation, certainly the trade issues was the major theme, major subject. But there's also, I think, since this is the sort of second summit, in more than 6 months after the meeting in last December in Argentina. So I would assume that there are other bigger issues, border issues need to be discussed, since it's going to be an extended meeting. So the news release also said that there will be talk about the fundamental issues for the relationship. So certainly I think trade issues are very important, and I think President Xi, according to the press release, also mentioned that Chinese enterprises, should be treated fairly and in a way that will help the relationship. But the other border issues like Taiwan issues and the overall relationship, how President Trump viewed the overall relationship, because that is also very much concerned. And as a matter of fact, a lot of observers believe this is the root cause, or this is even more important than the trade issue. Trade issue is only the symptom. That there are bigger issues, structural issues need to be managed, if not, I think, fixed.
Final remarks goes to you, Mr. Stratford. How challenging is it, do you think, for both sides, United States and China, to build trust in the long run?
I think it's very challenging, and that's why we need to work so hard to make sure that it happens. I completely agree. One of my concerns is that even if we can reach a trade deal, and there are tough issues remaining. The best case scenario out of Osaka is the presidents walk out and say, we've instructed our trade negotiators to go back to the table. That's the best case, and they still have a lot of work to do. But even if we do that, we still have other things where the two governments have very different views, and they can undermine even the goodwill that's created if we get a good trade agreement. So we need to work very hard on these other issues, and each country needs to put a lot of effort into understanding the legitimate needs of the other side.
All right, thank you for all your analysis. Coming up after the break, how has the U.S.-China trade dispute complicated the global picture? And can the G20 summit settle the wider concerns of international actors? The escalating U.S.-China trade war will jeopardize global growth, according to the latest assessment by the International Monetary Fund. It is calculated that President Trump's latest threat of tariffs could see global GDP contract by 0.33% this year, rising to 0.5% in 2020. So how would this impact emerging economies, and how can these troubling predictions be avoided? Joining me on the phone from Kuala Lumpur is Professor Sufian Jusoh, Director at the Institute of Malaysia and International Studies. In New Delhi, Professor Singh from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And in our Beijing studio, Mr. Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to you all. So now, reports have suggested that China's economic slowdown could hurt Asian economies like Singapore that have greater trade links with China, and Malaysia may also find its impact as well. So let me start with Professor Jusoh, who is joining me on the phone. You are joining me from Kuala Lumpur. How are regional governments there reacting to the situation, and how do you read the intentions behind the trade war and the damage it has caused?
Okay, I think it's a bit of a shock because both Malaysia and Singapore are reliant on trade. We have more than 100% of the GDP. For Malaysia, international trade counts about 140%. For Singapore, it's about 200%. And they have to re-strategize. We have a lot of value chain products linked with China and both the United States. So what happened is, I think the governments in both countries, Malaysia and Singapore, are strategizing on what to do, how to position themselves, not only dealing with possible relocation, but also on how to find a new market. And at the same time, we are also facing threats from the United States government because they have put our currencies on the watch. So this is quite a tricky situation. Looking at India, India has also been on the watch, and so for ASEAN, Malaysia and Singapore, they really have to strategize, looking at a new way of doing business and how to find a solution to these threats.
Yeah, being exported-oriented economy, they're bound to feel a sizable impact, right? They sell many intermediate goods to China that are made into products then exported to U.S. But earlier this month, Trump removed India's favorable trade treatment from the Generalized System of Preferences. That is a program designed to help developing countries sell to U.S. consumers. I want to get an Indian perspective on this. The Trump administration has also called on China to abandon its status as a developing country. Professor Singh, some see the tariffs being issued under the pretext of a trade deficit as a measure to contain emerging economies like India and China, the two largest developing countries. Do you agree with that?
No doubt there is a geopolitics behind these tariff hikes in the name of trade deficit. When you look at the trade deficit with India, it's really very small. It's about $21 billion US. It's not much. I can understand the trade deficit with China is much bigger. And India had had this privilege of this having a special arrangement for certain section of its exports to United States for almost since early 1970s. So there is no doubt there is the politics determining these kind of initiatives, and a strong leader addressing his own constituency, pushing America first, is doing it. And I think this creates much more opportunities. In fact, word disruption in today's discourses is seen more as an opportunity than challenge. And I think this provides enormous space for emerging economies to find their own alternative ways of dealing with this problem of global economy being impacted with first and the second largest economy having trade tensions. So I assume there is going to be greater cooperation with China and other emerging economies. I understand as United States is raising tariffs against Chinese exports to United States, China at the same time is becoming lenient and bringing down tariffs for exports of other countries to China. So that will immediately have a positive impact on how other countries build their economic engagement with China. And I think this will partly also address the deficit problem that India has had with China. So we might see specifically India's exports to China increasing, but there is a bigger responsibility that both China and India and other emerging economies have here. I think this constant tension triggered by United States economic sanctions and trade tariffs is rattling the global economy, and in that sense I think there is an emerging focus now this week at G20 as to how the other 19 minus United States are going to come together and provide a certain amount of direction to the global economy to ensure that the growth rates do not slide the way they have been kind of projected by various institutions. And I think this in that sense will bring emerging economies, China on the lead, much closer together to find alternative solutions to how to address the problem of global economy and growth rates shrinking triggered by the tariffs and economic sanctions of President Donald Trump.
Now, Mr. Yang, let me bring you into this. What do you make of what's being said here, finding new opportunities in such a challenging time? Because we have heard Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping standing side by side, both supported globalization and opposed unilateralism at the SCO meeting held in mid-June in Kyrgyzstan. Do you see the strong partnership taking shape in creating some kind of a global front against the rising protectionism?
Yes, actually, Trump's war on U.S. major trading partners bring pressures and challenges to everyone related. However, also bring opportunities for the U.S. trading partners get together to enhance the cooperation in several, in a wide range of areas, ranging from the policy issues like enhancing the globalization, multilateralism, to concrete bilateral, multilateral free trade cooperation. Especially for China and India, both of them now under pressures of the trade war from the United States. Such pressures will certainly input momentum for further and wider cooperation between the two largest developing countries in trade, investment, and many other areas.
Yeah, both economies have somehow involved in a dispute with the United States, and we've heard Chinese Vice Foreign Minister saying that trade frictions between China and the United States and the fear of trade frictions between U.S. and India may become a crucial subject for talks between China and India. So, Mr. Yang, over to you once again. How is China responding to this situation? What can China and India do together to fend off what's being called trade bullying from the U.S.?
Well, I think the current situation provides both challenges and opportunities. In terms of opportunities, I think the current situation forces both China and India try best effort to diversify their respective overseas market. Needless to say, both China and India has been on high degree of dependence on U.S. market. But because of the protectionism and the unilateralism from Trump administration, China and India have to do some measures to rebalance our trading structure. Primarily, the two countries will try to make joint efforts to explore both domestic markets, enhance the Indian-China bilateral trade. So, in short, challenges facing the United States, but opportunities when India and China face to face.
Professor Singh, your thoughts on this? Is this going to become a concern not only for China and India, but also for other countries in the region as well?
definitely when you have larger economies in trouble with each other, it's going to have impact on the global economy, and of course smaller economies and least developed countries would get impacted as well. But I think important to understand is that in principle this is creating a space for developing nations to look at alternatives. For example, RCEP is one area where you have this whole emerging group of largest free trading area possibility, where you have United States not there. So will the 19 be able to do something together, or some of the 19? For example, Indian Prime Minister has proposed that this week at G20 there should also be Russia, China, India national leaders meeting. So obviously they are going to explore opportunities. At the same time, important to understand not to be too ambitious, because each of these three countries, Russia, China, India, share a very different relationship with United States. India is now the defense partner, major defense partner of United States. We have our own set of, India has its own set of problems with United States, which would include our purchases of defense equipment from Russia, issues of visas, issues of opening our data for free transmission around the world. So each of these three countries would have their own set of issues with the United States, but at the same time I think this trading issue is what is uniting them together, and there is a limited bandwidth where we could think of these three nations building some kind of joint strategies. They have always from 1999 had their own perceptions of global and regional issues, which have always been at variance with United States. So this is only upgrading their foreign ministers trilateral to now national leaders coming together. But Russia, China, India do have a certain space where they can expand their cooperation to address problems both of trade, and I think more immediately the problem of oil crisis, where China and India are not able to purchase oil from Iran and Venezuela. So Russia could be a potential supplier. There is a certain complementarity here among these three nations, but I think we need to be also pragmatic and not be overambitious as to what can be achieved from these three nations working together to deal with challenges thrown up by the United States.
And Professor Jusoh, I want to get your thoughts on what's going to happen next. If President Trump goes ahead with the additional tariffs on $300 billion more Chinese imports, despite a reportedly suspension, what would be the consequence for Southeast Asian economies? And do you think, is it likely that we're going to reverse that decision at this time's G20 summit?
If the United States continue with the isolationist and protectionist and mercantilist approach, then we have to find another alternative, which is to look into RCEP and regional arrangements, South-South, without the United States. So they are going to lose out and become isolated. We cannot go back to the 19th century mentality to address domestic politics by using international partners as pawns. So I think this is very clear.
Thank you so much for your analysis. That's Professor Sufian Joseph at Institute of Malaysia and International Studies. Professor Singh joining us from New Delhi at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also here in Beijing, Professor Xiyu, Senior Fellow at China Institute of International Studies. And that's all from this edition of The Point. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the CGTN app to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point.